Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Reframing LGBTQ plus rights as human rights. My name is Dr. Erica Jane Friedman. I welcome all pronouns, and I am the Associate Director for LGBTQA initiatives at Florida International University. I'm honored to serve as your moderator today for our discussion. I would like to start by thanking our host program, the Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy, which is part of the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs at FIU. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors, my Office of LGBTQA Initiatives, Multicultural Programs and Services Office, which is what our office is housed under, the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series, Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center, the Center for Women's and Gender Studies, and the Jewish Museum of Florida, all a part of FIU. I would also like to introduce our panelists briefly. We have Dr. Jessie Aburab, who uses she, her pronouns. She is visiting assistant professor for the Center for Women's and Gender Studies at FIU. We also have Dr. Marcus Thiel, who uses he, him pronouns. He is associate professor for the Department of Politics and International Relations and is director of the EU Jean Monnet Center for Excellence at FIU. And I'm very pleased to welcome for a brief discussion at the start before we jump into Q&A, our ambassador Ana Elena Chacon, who is ambassador of Costa Rica to Spain and former second vice president of Costa Rica. And so I'd like to allow the ambassador to take a few minutes to give us some introductory words, and then we'll jump into the discussion. Thank you so much, Ambassador.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. I'm going to speak in Spanish. Déjenme decirles que hoy más que nunca suscribo la Declaración de los Derechos Humanos de 1948, en donde dice con claridad que la libertad, la justicia y la paz en el mundo tienen por base el reconocimiento de la dignidad intrínseca de los derechos iguales, inalienables de todos los miembros de la familia humana. Y es precisamente por eso que estoy convencida que todos los seres humanos debemos de perseguir este ideal. Es más, a mí me resulta un imperativo ético para quienes nos ha correspondido estar en la función pública, poder dictar normas que permitan una vida más digna para todos nuestros conciudadanos. Desde el año 2014 al 2018 tuve el enorme orgullo de acompañar a Luis Guillermo Solís Rivera como vicepresidenta del país, y fueron años en los que avanzamos en materia de derechos humanos con una perspectiva mucho más robusta que la que se había tenido quizás en algunos años atrás. Nosotros logramos darle un rostro a cada acción y a cada política pública, sacando de la oscuridad a miles de personas que por causa de la intolerancia, la exclusión social o por estar presos todavía en una sociedad patriarcal habían sido invisibilizados. Es por eso que quisiera relatar algunos de los logros en materia de igualdad y no discriminación que dimos en esos años. En el año 2014 se reconoce el derecho al seguro social para las parejas del mismo sexo. En el año 2015 ampliamos la definición de compañero o compañera para aquella persona que convive de forma estable bajo el mismo techo con otra persona del mismo sexo, y precisamente se establecen procesos de discriminación en las instituciones para que exista un régimen sancionatorio que pueda realmente decir que no estábamos dispuestos a tolerar que nadie fuese discriminado. Y además se ordenó en el sistema de información inscribir a las parejas del mismo sexo. Aún así, el país seguía avanzando, pero no en una forma de carácter universal que tocase a todas las personas, puesto que cada acción que hacíamos tenía una implementación de carácter público y no era para toda la ciudadanía. Entonces, en el año 2016 me permití formular dos preguntas ante la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos. La primera, si los derechos derivados de una pareja del mismo sexo estaban contemplados en la legislación y en la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos, y si el cambio de nombre de manera administrativa sin una prescripción médica podían también hacerse precisamente de esa forma. Y entonces la Corte notificó la decisión en el año 2018 en la cual establecía parámetros de acatamiento para todo el sistema interamericano de derechos humanos y diciendo que el derecho convencional, es decir, el derecho derivado de las convenciones, decía que no podíamos discriminar absolutamente a nadie. Y es allí precisamente en donde continuamos entonces sabiendo más que nunca que la dignidad humana nos pertenece a todas las personas, por serlos, porque no es exclusiva la dignidad de ningún grupo, que no es definida por las creencias y no es definida por los sentimientos. Y el avance de los derechos humanos ha sido un proceso muy largo, ha sido un proceso lleno de obstáculos y ha sido una realidad gracias a miles de personas que desde la sociedad civil, desde la academia y desde gobiernos inspiraron importantes logros y realmente tenemos que admitirlo así. Porque también yo creo que hoy es un día y un momento importante para que hablemos de la ética dentro de la política pública, porque la ética no es un asunto de nuestro tiempo, es un mandato precisamente que involucra el hoy, el ayer y el mañana, que involucra la inteligencia, la razón. Y cuando hablamos de servicio público, se debe de hacer con justicia. Se debe de pensar en todas las personas, se debe de priorizar en ellas. Implica respeto a la dignidad humana, esencia de los derechos humanos, y significa actuar con total transparencia, porque siempre debe existir en aras del interés público esa dignidad. Y eso es lo que las democracias modernas hoy hacemos un llamado, porque si queremos sobrevivir como democracias, si queremos fortalecernos, no podemos ser indiferentes al hambre, no podemos ser indiferentes a la exclusión, a la desigualdad y tampoco a los procesos discriminatorios de aquellos que son mirados como diferentes, de aquellos que son mirados estigmatizados por a quién aman o en qué piel y cómo deciden evolucionar dentro de ella. La diversidad humana es enorme, está llena de colores y tiene muchos matices, y es ahí en donde debemos de incluir a todas las personas en igualdad, con justicia, mediante el uso de la ley, y quizás el mayor reto de nuestra vida democrática es el respeto a esa ética. Es por eso que ciertamente en América Latina los actos de violencia hacia la población LGTBI han generado muchísimo dolor, aflicción, mucha muerte y mucha soledad también, porque han estado desprovistas del beneficio de la seguridad social, de la vivienda, de los alimentos y de tantos otros derechos humanos, entre ellos el más violentado, el vivir en condición de pobreza. La única razón para estas desprotecciones ha sido la discriminación por orientación sexual e identidad de género, que enfrenta a quienes se les humilla y se les trata aún como si tuviera una patología. Y eso que ya hace mucho la OMS nos dio realmente cuál era el diagnóstico, que no existía ninguna patología. Realmente la opinión consultiva que hicimos marca un antes y un después para nuestra región, para todos los países del sistema interamericano en materia de derechos humanos a favor de la población LGTBI. La Corte dijo algo muy claro y los invito a leer esa resolución porque es una pieza que llena el alma de quienes podemos leerla, y dice que la dignidad humana es una sola, que la igualdad de derechos es indiscutible y que no distingue por orientación sexual ni por identidad de género. Es más, se abre una luz para la región de Latinoamérica, para que como humanidad nos alejemos de esa discriminación estructural que todavía se podrían vivir en muchos países, de la estigmatización y de otras formas de violencia contra una población que ha sido víctima histórica de flagelos y exclusión. Significa con esta resolución que se reivindican los derechos que antes estaban vedados, no solo en Costa Rica, sino en otros lugares. También significa que amar es una condición humana que merece el mismo reconocimiento y la misma protección por parte del Estado, sin excusas, sin diferencias, sin estigmas, sin violencia, sin discriminación, sin extrañezas y sin señalamiento de ninguna índole. Porque categóricamente la Corte también dijo que las personas trans tienen derecho a su nombre, a su identidad, mediante procesos expeditos de fácil acceso. Y así también la Corte resolvió que las parejas del mismo sexo sí son iguales porque tienen los mismos derechos, y eso significa que los gobiernos de turno deben de garantizar los derechos que se derivan de un vínculo familiar en la misma forma que lo venían haciendo con la llamada familia tradicional. Agradezco la atención, agradezco el espacio, pero sobre todo agradezco el honor de haber podido servir a mi patria bajo el mandato del presidente Solís, respetuoso de los derechos humanos, que siempre nos encaminó para llevar un pedacito de dignidad a cada rincón de nuestra querida patria, y esperamos exportarlo a muchos países del sistema interamericano. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Chacon. So now I'd like to start with asking all three of our panelists some questions. But first, I just want to let everybody, all the participants know, first of all, thank you for being here. It's lovely to see everybody. I see the number increasing of people who are coming in. And I just like to invite you at any point, if you have questions for any of our panelists, you can use the Q&A feature to drop a question in there. I will communicate those questions out to our panelists and make sure that they get answered throughout the time. We are going to be going until, well, we'll see what happens, but probably about 1:30, maybe a little after 1:30 if we get lively, but making sure that we're honoring everybody's time on the panel as well. So thank you so much, Ambassador Chacon. That was a great way to kick things off. And I am so proud of Costa Rica for the recent same-gender marriage passing. It's just great to see other countries starting to pass laws that are respecting people's orientations and relationships in a way that gives them dignity and equality with other people in the country. So we'd love to see more of that right here in the United States, because I know that even across states, we do not have equal rights. It depends on what state you're living in, what rights you have. There are still, right here in the United States, only about 15 different states that cover all of the different rights that we are seeking, not just same-gender marriage, but there's a lot. So, we have a lot of work to do, and I know that the people right here on our panel are looking at and investigating a lot of that work already. So just to kick things off, since this is reframing LGBTQ rights as human rights, given some of the criticisms about LGBTQ plus rights being Western and colonizing in their very nature, especially when applied globally, what makes LGBTQ plus rights human rights? What do our panelists have to say about that?
Jesse, do you want to start up? Ladies first.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ambassador Chacon, for that amazing speech. I would like to say thank you, Erica and Marcus, for inviting me to this panel. Again, on my end, I would also like to add one more acknowledgement, which begins by paying my respects to the traditional custodians of this land and their elders, past and present. The territory that we now call South Florida has been a traditional homelands of the native nations, including the Calusa, the Tequesta, and today the Seminole and Miccosukee. So regarding that one, I've had one slide that basically summarized the speech that the Ambassador Chacon was saying. If you'd like, Andre, to put, basically, all human beings are born free, equal in dignity and rights. So there are criticism, like you said, Erica, that human rights are Western concepts that do not reflect the culture of the non-Western society, and they might have some validity in the way they were practiced. But again, that basic sentence where it was introduced in 1948, it was acknowledged by 193 members, state members of the United Nations. They all agreed to support that statement. So while criticism of universalism presents its valid issues, again, this statement, this decree basically is acknowledged by all member states. So owing to this simple fundamental statement, LGBTQIA plus rights are basically human rights. Would you like to add something, Marcus, to that, or you want?
Sure, thank you. Well, yeah, thanks everyone, and Erica, and as well as SIPA, the School of International Public Affairs of ours, for organizing this great panel. Yeah, I'm an European Union scholar as well as sort of international relations scholars, just like Jesse is, and so. I'm glad that you put out Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right, which is sort of the standard sentence and main statement. I just want to play a little bit devil's advocate and also kind of acknowledge that despite sort of the theoretical universality of these human rights that are of course inherent to each of everyone, we need to also consider how these are applied and what effects these human rights have in specific cultural, religious, political and historical contexts. And more recently, just coming out from the scholarship, you've seen sort of a historiographical analysis of the development of human rights, because they didn't come out of nowhere, right? If you think about how did human rights, sort of the first rudimentally recognition of human rights globally was sort of reserved for maybe only white males, right? Free man, so there's left of already 50% of the population of whichever political entity. And then you morph on, and in the 18th, 19th century, after the Enlightenment, right, it was still reserved to the land owning elite, the white bourgeois elite, who was able to sip their coffees and just philosophize about life, right? Whereas the other ones had to work to enable them to think about the value of universal human rights. And then let's just move further to 1948, the establishment of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right, where that Human Rights Declaration was, is signed by 193, but at the time there were only about 50 nations in the United Nations, right? Plus, it was basically an ideological superpower contest, which is why we still have sort of these two different human rights protocols attached to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? The Western liberal civil rights catalog, and then you remember these socio-economic group rights that are much more collectivist, socialist in their origins, and that still many countries, including the US, still have not ratified, right? So I'm just want to add to that quickly that human rights also need to be considered in the as sort of also as ideological constructs, even though they are by nature inherently should be universally applicable. We have to be very careful, because I'm researching a lot about the European Union, which kind of tries to universally spread all kinds of human rights without acknowledging that there is a real life hierarchy of rights existing, and that you cannot achieve all the same rights at the same time in the same context or in different contexts. I'll leave it at that, but happy to talk more about it.
Exactly. Theoretically, this is the statement, but in practice, right? Different spaces, they look at it differently. And you hit it really well when you said that certain societies look up to the individual as the primary, focus when you talk about human rights, and those definitions, statements are too broad to be interpreted in a functional way universally, because other societies, such as in the case of the Middle East and North Africa, it's the culture, it's the family, it's the tribe, it's the religion that takes precedence. You are the daughter, the son, or the whatever before who you are individually. So of course, many people, many groups of people become invisible. They're not even seen. They do not exist. These are the fabrication of the West coming into and making them spoil or kind of tarnish the cultural, the decency within that they have within religious or culture or communal whatnot. So, exactly.
And I don't know, I don't want to, Ambassador Chacon, if you have something to add to that. But Erica, if I may just add for a second, and Jesse, exactly, we see this now also, right? How in the UN, because in 1948, you know, LGBT rights were not, right? They were, you know, were not recognized. They didn't exist for the most part, right? So we see now, interestingly, how international LGBT rights advocates try to connect, you know, LGBT rights not as exactly these new special rights, which is often the argument of opponents being made, right? But saying, like, you know, they try to connect it to already existing rights prescriptions that exist, for example, in the United Nations for women's rights, right? But you see now that after 2007, when the UN's Yogyakarta, Indonesian Yogyakarta Human Rights Declaration, which is not legally binding for LGBT rights, was drafted, you've seen how then Yogyakarta scholars try to connect LGBT rights to women's rights. And what's now happening is that the opponents of LGBT rights try to not only limit LGBT rights, but try to limit gender right. So they say specifically, and here I can cite, you know, the Polish government or the Hungarian government in the European Union, they say they were vetoing the recent COVID recovery fund because there was a reference towards women's and gender rights. And they asked to rephrase it as the rights of men and women, right? To kind of, you know, get not in a gray area of gender and just keep it in a binary of men and women. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, I just want to have one statement. If you have been historically discriminated, you need to put this into actions. That's why gender rights and LGBT rights and all the minority rights, even though as women we are not a minority, we have to talk about that. And we have to have special politics so we can visualize our needs that has been denied for very many years. So that's why it's very important to see all, you know, the compact of the human beings, because we have been ruled by men for many years also, saying what they need, and now we have some different needs that are put in the public policies also.
There's so many things that I want to jump in on. I'm actually going to go a little bit back to Dr. Abu Rab because you brought up religion, and we have a question from the audience about religion specifically, about it becoming a factor, you know, when introducing LGBTQ rights. I would say right here in the United States and abroad. So I want to see, specifically speaking to the concern of religion and how to address that on that kind of relativistic level. You know, how do you both honor people's culture and religion and also introduce LGBTQ rights into certain countries?
Definitely. This is one of the elements about cultural relativism versus universalism, when many people conflate that pushing for LGBTQ rights is basically you're pushing for secularism. And in countries like in North Africa and the Middle East, my area of focus, most of these states are sectarian. In the case of Lebanon, it's deeply sectarian to the degree that it has 18 different sects that have to be represented there. So imagine 18 different sects that have different political agendas. And when it comes for you to come from the top down, telling them, well, LGBTQ rights are human rights, their reaction is going to be like, no, it does not work that way. You're pushing for secularism. You're trying to take away our identity. And their reasoning is not because they understand what the issues are. It's mostly political. It's a reaction, and that's what's happening. You can connect to it in the U.S. when you have conservative point of views that think that if you start pushing for certain rights, the basic rights, that means you're trying to take away their right of religious freedom practice. You're trying to kind of abolish their way of living. You're introducing foreign ideas that might spoil the minds and the brains of their people. So most of these attempts, universally coming down top bottom, have been a failure in the Middle East, and have been resisted the connecting issues of gender and sexuality to drug use and prostitution and all that stuff. It's like when here they say, when you ask for legalizing marijuana, it's the door for heavier drugs, you know, be careful, and you're gonna be ruining the whole community. So in that sense, when it comes to religion, many positive attempts have been made by kind of engaging them from a local aspect, bottom up. Instead of saying that religion should be abolished, in the case of Lebanon, they've been asking for a 19th sect, which is basically civil freedom and a secular choice for people to exist as citizen within that country. And it's been really brought down, because just by bringing the option for them, you're opening up a can of worms that would kind of be the demise of their existence. So that is the issue. I don't know. I hope I answered the question correctly.
Yeah, and I would actually love to hear from Ambassador Chacon about the barriers that maybe emerged for you, in particular on the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and the process for gaining egalitarian marriage for same-gender couples. What were some of the barriers? Did you face anything related to religion? And then what were some of the other ones that came up as well?
Yes, of course. Well, I'm very respectful, you know, for your private and personal beliefs. But I think that you have to rule with two very important things: human rights and the constitution of your country. That's that's the way to do it. Of course, we have a lot of consulting. There were a lot of people talking about this. And then it became like a big division between somebody and some religions and others, that they were thinking that this was a sin. You know, I've never saw, you know, loving somebody else as a sin. So we put this in the agenda, and it was pretty difficult to talk this by the point of view, in scientific point of view, human rights point of view, and not your personal beliefs and that the Bible says or not says. So, of course, this was very difficult. It was very difficult for me personally, because I got a lot of attacks telling me very horrible things, and my family too, and the government also. But I'm glad that we went through, because, you know, when you are right, you have to go through with your beliefs. It's not, we're not imposing anything. We are just opening the rights that has been left behind for some population. So that will always be, especially in a Catholic country like Costa Rica, that's Catholic by constitution, and that we have also a lot of congressmen and congresswomen that they are from an evangelistic church. So this is, you know, quite difficult to manage, but I think that we have to go through with human rights and constitution, and that's it. And be brave. That's a very important thing. If you want to rule a country, you have to be brave.
May I just add quickly for a second onto yeah, I think that's very good that you have this, Ambassador Chacon, the experience from your legal work, because I mean, courts are over and over again, if you do comparative political analyses, they're seen as the most reliable, most trustworthy political institutions in countries across the world, right? Compared to, you know, executives or compared to legislatures. So I think courts have really an exceptional role in safeguarding LGBT plus rights. They cannot, in states, I think we got to be careful, states, in my opinion at least, and many other ones who have more of a queer theoretical inclination, states cannot be giver of rights, right? Particularly if you think about it, if they're inherently dignity, then a state, a superseding institution, cannot give you rights that you already have. But states should be, but again, we need to qualify this for democracies as well, right? States then should be guarantors of rights. And although, I mean, non-democracies have different types of rights, but there we go back to the liberal versus socialist tensions. So they can be guarantor of rights, and courts here really have an exceptional role to play. And we see this over and over again in Latin America, right? We see this in Europe with the European Court of Human Rights, the EU's highest court of justice. They set precedents, even here in the US. Remember the 2015 court judgment, right, that declared same-sex marriage legal across the US. So over and over again, states have become courts have become really the most important political bodies for the maintenance and guarantee of LGBT plus rights.
Sometimes you just need to reassure the rights that you have because you are a human being, but you have to have you have to rule it, and you have to have the word of the judges, and it's very important.
Definitely. If I may provide the second slide regarding what you were saying, Ambassador Chacon, exactly. Here, I would like to highlight Lebanon's penal code and highlight the small victories that were able to be done while kind of engaging those penal code. As you see, Article 534 is the main basically legal statement that kind of provide room for discrimination towards LGBTQIA plus community. And basically it states, any sexual intercourse against nature is punished with up to 1 year of imprisonment. That's the minimum. But that little statement that is there for you to see, it's not just Lebanon. It's more than the majority of the countries that are until this date criminalizing gender and sexual, like basically LGBTI plus communities. And if you look at the history, since we're tracing it back, most of these countries inherited these laws from the colonial powers, the British and the French, most importantly. Those same statements existed in England in the 1800s under the Victorian rule, where they thought that any type of sexual relations that is not there for procreation is considered unnatural. And just that little statement, there's no wording about queer community, there's no wording about homosexuality, there's no wording about anything. But from there, all these practices have emanated and whatnot. And the second article that is there, which is basically public indecency, where if you just hold hands and kiss and you don't happen to be a heterosexual couple, you're providing all sorts of, decadence and whatnot that is kind of treated as a way that is discriminatory to the society, community, again, there. So you see the conflation of gender identity and sexual orientation, all of these under that little unnatural sex. So again, those laws and whatnot were there, and the way that was been won those little victories is by engaging those articles. There were several instances where judges were the actual pioneers, where you had a case of a trans woman being held captive, been tried under the issue of public indecency. Most of them, they consider them as men disguising as women, connecting it with theft and deceit and deceit of morality. And then the actual judge claimed that case dismissed because the homosexuality is not part of the unnatural sex and whatnot. So by engaging these laws, again, as Ambassador Chacon and Marcus T were saying, these are the ways that those communities were able to hold those small victories.
Thank you all for that. So we have lots of questions coming in from people. I'm going to do my best to answer everybody's. Or to get to everybody so we can get some answers to all your questions. I'm going to start with a question. How is the United States viewed around the world on LGBTQ issues? Are they viewed as a leader or questionable ally? What is your sense of that, panelists?
Well, I mean, I would definitely say either from the left or from the right, it's more viewed as a questionable ally, or let's say as an unreliable ally, right? Because as you know, with each administration, particularly, opposing administrations, almost to the exact opposite in terms of international LGBT rights promotion.
Well, again, depends on the context. You need to know the context in that sense. You cannot also generalize and stereotype the way it happens everywhere just because of different incidents and whatnot. We cannot really do it. So I do agree. Questionable ally depends on the situation and what has been.
I don't want to talk about the United States or any country in particular. I just want to say that human rights, you can go one step forward and then one step back. So it's not an easy fight. You have to fight it every day. Even though you have achieved human rights, you have to remember that they are there. You have to fight for them. You have to say they are my rights. And that happens around the world. I know that with different types of government and different presidents or whatever, but it's important, to fight from the academia, from the social society. We know for us, women feminists, that wants our rights to be respected also. So it's not an easy thing to achieve, and it's not an easy thing that will stay forever and ever. It's not that I have it now, I will have it my whole life.
Yeah, 100%. And if you look,
yeah.
sorry.
Go
If you look at the Middle East, for example, the US hasn't played the best role ever in being there for the population. Many countries in the Middle East, they look at the US as the, supporting the enemy and whatnot, and not being there for their interest, but mostly for the interest of the Israel, the neighbor that they still at war with, especially in the case of Lebanon and Syria, in that context. So any initiative made from the US, even when it's humanitarian, helping local organizations, they have to work around it sensitively, being sensitive to the local community, how they're approaching it and whatnot.
Yeah, and if I may add on to that, I do think, and as a scholar of the EU, I see particularly the contrast between the US and the EU, right? And over again, no matter which policy area, you notice that whereas the European Union, and not that I'm trying to praise here the European Union, I have a lot of criticism against it as well. By the European Union, the Europeans in general, the states aim more at engagement with, even governments that they disagree, right? In the US, you often find, particularly on the Republican administration side, more of a sort of, isolationist tendencies, and sort of non-engagement. I think if there's like Javier Corrales, ask any advice for Biden, right? The incoming Biden administration, I think that sort of engagement and listening, and this not only includes exactly listening to the local needs of civil society in the countries concerned, but also listening to the governments. There are many IR scholars, including Antti Wiener, who says, we're never going to international norm promotion is based on arguing over rights, negotiating over rights. It would be almost dictatorial, right? If you were to kind of, impose the same rights for everyone at the same level. And so norm negotiation, norm contestation, while it costs a lot of energy and political capital, I think is important. And that's short advice for the Biden administration.
I appreciate so much what you're all saying, about governments change, situations change, so we have to keep pushing and keep pursuing, and it's not like you just gain them and then we're done. And I would love, Dr. Abarava, if you could bring up the map that you had
Definitely.
on one of your slides. It demonstrates, I think, how much work there is left to do, and that those things do shift with different administrations that come in. And it's good to have a visual, I think, for everybody to see.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are different rights along the bottom, and there's still a lot of work to be done. And I know we see a lot of red right over there, and Africa and Middle East. And so I want to turn a little bit to you, Dr. Avarab, because you have a book that recently came out on the Syrian refugee situation. And I'd love for you to just speak a little bit about, from that research, what are some examples of how national and international government agencies impact or play a role in the day-to-day experiences of LGBTQ plus refugees specifically?
Definitely, Erica. Thank you for sharing that map. Again, if you look at the map, the red means like it's bad. Basically, there's around 71 countries around the world that still make same-sex relations illegal, and of course, conflating it with gender identity and all this stuff. So from those, half of them were basically, again, former British colonies, protectorate, in that way that inheriting those laws that criminalize unnatural sex, which they conflate with homosexuality, drug use, prostitution, debauchery, all this stuff within. So when you just mention it, your rights are not about same-sex marriage or relationship. Your rights as an individual, as a human being, are threatened. Okay, and that's when it comes to Syrian refugees, you are at a double tragedy that I call. One, as a refugee, when it case in my study, when as refugees moving away from their country and the crisis, they go to neighboring countries that have long historical relationship, with them, either as friends, neighbors, brotherhood, and at the same time enemies that were at a 30-year period controlled by the Syrian government. So of course they're not going to be welcomed with flowers and open hands, but it's a mixed feeling of being humanitarian, helping them, and at the same time all the PTSDs come out, and the negative xenophobic reaction towards the Syrians come out and whatnot. Recently, a few days ago, there was an incident in one village where there was a fight between one Syrian man and a Lebanese resident, and the Lebanese resident was shot. The entire village attacked all the Syrians, kids and mothers and fathers, kicked them out of the village, telling them to go back home. So for you to see the sensitivity. And again, the context, like you were saying, Erica, Lebanon is not in the best shape that it is today, from economic collapse to political tragedy, basically corruption, all these stuff. An actual bomb as the size of Hiroshima exploded due to the corruption and whatnot. So people are hungry, people are angry, people do not have anything to do with what's happening, but they're suffering, the Syrian refugees. So how about that double tragedy, you belonging to the LGBTQI plus community that is non-existent? So just by you walking, your mobility is threatened, not just as a Syrian, but as a person who's not wanted. Seeking help. If you want to show, please, the fourth slide, Andres. That one, it's kind of my, in a way, summary of what's happening. When it comes to Syrian refugees, there's two major institutions. The Lebanese government, which we just said, like it's mainly absent. It doesn't exist. They're still like debating and fighting where the government should be, and they're not elected yet. And from the end of the international community, the main agency is the UNHCR. And both agencies, basically, they get together and they made a plan, like a contract, like how we're going to work around. And even though the UNHCR has a mandate to push for LGBTQ rights and all this stuff, and you as human rights, right? But in application, they are not able, because Lebanon do not even recognize the Syrian refugees as actual refugees with unalienable rights. They consider them as visitors that are not allowed to work, that are not allowed to have decency, decent life. They need to go back. The whole political issues there, trying to push them away. And the only thing that the UNHCR can do is go underground, like all the local agencies, work around it. So if a Syrian refugee disclose that he's part of the LGBTQIA plus community, they refer them to third agencies. And most local agencies that work on those issues, they are registered in a different way, either under the umbrella of providing health, tests for HIV, STIs, to advocacy group and whatnot, because they cannot officially claim that they are supporting LGBTQIA plus individuals. So imagine lack of information, lack of communication, lack of legal processes for them to not be detained arbitrarily because the government is absent again, right? The police enforcement, all these, they have the impunity to arrest you just because you look different. Again, a man disguised as a woman, a threat, and giving the previous threats like that we've seen also, from car explosion to ISIS to Daesh, all these passed through Lebanon. So imagine the situation of the LGBTQIA plus Syrian refugees within. So in a way, there are small victories that are happening again through this chaos. Just the mere presence of the international community, UNHCR, the funding that comes, even though it's little. The UNHCR puts the LGBTQI rights under the umbrella of SGBV, sexual and gender-based violence, which in the plan they do not even mention LGBTQI people. They mention people from different communities, right? Or women and girls. And under that umbrella, they provide the funds, which is like a fraction of what the entire funds come. But still, they are able to negotiate whatever they can and to either repatriate those that are under the threat of just to exist, right? Move them to Canada, the US, or other places, or they try the best that they can. So yeah.
Thank you for that. I love this graphic too. It helps explain kind of how things are all connected and overlapping too. So I really appreciate that. There, you brought up economic, plight of the Syrian refugees as well, and I think that's a really interesting topic to bring into this at an intersection of many other aspects of our diverse LGBTQ communities. And it goes to one of the questions that someone asked as well, which is around that intersection of LGBTQ rights and economic rights. And this individual pointed out, in particular for women and racial minorities, addressing the feminization of poverty and structural racism. So I'm curious what each of your thoughts are about that intersection for the diversity of our communities that represent LGBTQ people worldwide. I mean, it's a big question, right? But how do we address those economic rights in the first place? How does that intersect with our queerness?
Well, if I may just quickly say something about that, I think one is the larger point of sort of intersectionality, and I think that's one of that addresses a couple of questions actually in here that were asked, which I can't keep up following the chats, is sort of, we need to, intersectionality is very important, meaning that, LGBT rights should not be over visibly exposed and therefore politicized or even securitized, right? So, but we have to see the decline in LGBT rights in companion to sort of the larger global political context, where we see now a decline in democratic equality across the world, not only through COVID, but in general. For the first time in 20 years, there seemed to be more autocracy across the world than declared democracies. So these, in that sense, to have an intersectional analysis requires not only allying with other causes. Gender groups are women's groups are very instrumental in that sense, because they have also more leverage in general across the board. But also, anti-racism groups. In Europe, it would be sort of groups that work against Islamophobia, against anti-Semitism and so on. But this is not only the intersectional analysis of the problem, but then also real intersectionality also requires that you have an intersectional, broader approach towards solution. That is arguably difficult, right? But I see, for example, the EU pushing LGBT rights in global South country while at the same time trying to either impose economic conditionality for aid. Again, going back to to what happened with Britain, right? When Britain, David Cameron's prime minister said we're going to cut countries who don't, who don't maintain LGBT rights, not acknowledging that the British government criminalized homosexuality across the board in the 1860s worldwide in their empire. And secondly, that cut in aid actually makes things worse for civil society groups in the countries concerned. They were actually writing protest letter against the threatened aid cuts. So I think an intersectional approach, the EU there needs to be clearer about sort of, what the negative trade-offs of their economic policies are globally, right? And I think we need to also build broader alliances to not only address the decline in LGBT rights or the maintenance of those, but also to address the broader issues of democratic backsliding that's occurring globally. I can go into detail, but I don't know.
Yeah, Marcus, actually, I would love, because I know that you've written so much about other countries, where there's significant policy change and just like generally how there are sometimes there are setbacks and sometimes there's achievements. And I wanted to hear from your observations and in bringing in this intersectionality piece too, how that gets addressed. From your observations and research, what are some of the driving factors behind the achievements that are made and the setbacks that we have, and how can we bring that nuance in of intersectionality?
Yeah. Well, so I mentioned already sort of, realizing the opportunities that courts and legal adjudication has, right? And sort of the recognition of those and the value that they domestically play. Then also what Dr. Abu Arab, Jesse already mentioned, that we really need to listen also to the local needs of the domestic civil society groups and not basically so the imperatives of global northern funders, right, such as the European Union or the USAID or so. Then, of course, this is more complicated, but if we're really looking at long-term improvements, we need to have better coordinated interplay of domestic civil society, the national that were so nicely mentioned in your graph, the national governments, and sort of intergovernmental organizations, such as the UN, right, which does great work in the Human Rights Council, the international regional courts, and so on and so on. And also exactly connecting with other causes and just being aware of the ambiguity and the problems that hypervisibility may cause for the people, right? Where coming out is not, the natural way of being, for example. And then setbacks, I mean, there are plenty. Again, it's a lot of incoherence. I see this even within the EU, where the EU promotes externally an LGBT rights ideal that they cannot even manifest internally, right? A rapid transformation. It's almost going back to the end of history vision, overly normative, idealistic vision that doesn't correspond to the reality that's out there. And yeah, post-colonial resistance, although this is of course hard to overcome, but that the Europeans will be, always looked at twice whenever they're trying to enforce new rights that should be self-understood, right? Given their historical role.
100%. When you mentioned homocolonialism as like our goal is to help those people, the backwards, the victims with no voice, to come out of the closet, right? Come out of the closet and do it. And there were a lot of advertisement they put there, during different events when they want to celebrate International Coming Out Day, International Day Against Homophobia, all these stuff. They provide those actors and whatnot that are openly gay, but even though they have Lebanese backgrounds, but they live abroad. So for them, coming out is easier said than done. And then they push everybody like, this is the day you come out, whatnot. But when you go to the local and you talk to the people there, and through my field work that I did there when I were discussing all these sorts of gender and sexual based violence, most of them say, I don't want to come out. you know. They've been raised and born and grew under the idea that they have to live double life, that their sexual and gender life is basically the nocturnal life that they live in the shadows with their peers. They've been, for them, many of them, they are religious, they do believe in their religion, they do feel that they can exist within. And for you to tell them come out, they're like, but that's not what I want. I just want to be able to walk and be able, if I get caught, not punished or beaten or killed on the street. Before I want same-sex marriage, that's not what I really want. You know, what I want is to be able to be able to communicate with people that think similarly or feel the same way without feeling persecuted. And they've been able to do that again, like I said, under the underground. I remember 1998 MIRC, whatnot, those websites and channels where people could go under a pseudonym and communicate. And of course, technology has been very helpful for the Middle East and North Africa. I mean, starting with the Arab uprising to LGBTQIA plus rights. And in the case of Lebanon, they've been privileged that the government does not crack down on those things, that the internet is an open space. So definitely when the EU and whatnot provide funding, it's not how much you provide funding, even though it's how you provide it, to who you're giving it. And other than the corruption, whatnot, like for what cause are you listening? Are you communicating? These people, they just need to reclaim their voices and not to be given voices that are not theirs. So I'm sorry, I got excited. But thank you, Marcus, for highlighting that.
So we have a few more questions, and Marcus, if you want to answer.
No, I actually would have eventually, only if there's time, I would love to ask Ambassador Chacon about sort of, her impression of Costa Rica's vanguard and leading role, if she has any sort of, national experience, how Costa Rica may promote it within Central America or even Latin America. But that's maybe for later. Should we try to answer the questions?
Well, I was going to say we could go till about 1:45, and I'd love to hear an answer to that, Ambassador, if you have a few words to say about that.
Yes, of course. Costa Rica, has been a very avant-garde country. We had in the 19th century, we put education that will be public and obligatory for everybody. That was a big step. Then we have no army since 1949. We have no death penalty since the 19th century. So even though we have been going through in an area of a lot of conflict, sadly, because we really love our neighbors and we really love Latin America, but we are the longest democracy in the whole Latin America. But now when you get to some special, topics, like for example, if you say, okay, all women, they should have the same rights. Yes, of course. But women, they can have the same rights being in politics as men. Well, I'm not so sure about that, And then if you go through more things, is talking about minorities, populations that has been historical, discriminated. It's difficult, you have to fight for that. And to fight up for LGBT people, it's quite different. It depends in the letter that you are fighting for. For example, gays, they have more money, they have good works, they are a piece of society. I think very important because we are a machista society and patriarchal, but it's not the same to talk about trans girls, trans women. They are in poverty. They live in sexual work. They need education. I am very proud to tell you that in the Solis administration, we built up the first special school, and we took more than 200 girls, that they finished their primary school, they finished their high school, and some of them are in the university, and we respect their own name, and they have their own certificates of study. And that's not a little thing. You said 2 or 3 are in the university. That's a big step for a conventional country like Costa Rica. So it hasn't been easy, you know, to be disruptive and to be progressist and to tell everybody has the same rights, because we like to think we are equal, but sometimes you think they are more equal and less equal. So you have, you know, to give all these affirmative actions and put these people into the public policies and tell them they have the rights. You know, the disabled people, they have the right of same education and they can be in equal schools. And we did that. So it's a lot of things that you have to work, but especially you have to work poverty. I think it's very important that you have some financial independence so you can be yourself and not depend in others, you know, just to be autonomous. So it's very important to pull all that together, the interaction between institutions and always respecting what people want. It's not imposing anything. I always said same sex marriage is not an imposition. It's just now we have like 400 couples that had got married in the last year, and that's great. And there will be 1,000 that lives together and they don't want to get married, and that's great also. But now you are just giving rights that has been denied, and that's the important thing. Never being in public policies is an easy way, but you have to be there and you have to mark the difference, because just respecting the status quo, it's not your job, you know? You have to give voice to those who has been silenced for many, many years, and those who have been ashamed, and that's not a good thing to be. And also for those that sometimes had a lot of suffering in their own lives, and you just don't see it because your life is different. So you have to be in the skin of others to make a good politician. That's what I think about politics.
I love that you bring up so much there that intersects with other questions and ideas that have been brought up here with, you know, economic rights being so important. I'm so glad you brought up the school that was created, because I think that emphasizes the difference between equality and equity as well, where sometimes you do have to do specialized things for certain groups so that they can, you know, does equal the playing field then, right? It equals it out when you do something extra for a particular group, so that they can, you know, have an equal chance. So I love that, and I'm so glad that you brought that up. So I'm going to answer 2 more questions that are in the Q&A, and then we're going to have to wrap up. I want to start with one that's kind of a little more US focused. I can answer this one a little bit, and then we'll end on kind of like a larger question. So the question is, do you think with the new administration in the US, there will be a push for more LGBTQ plus rights, or will we see more backlash and deterrence from world leaders? And I think this makes me think about, you know, the alt-right things happening in Europe a little bit, Marcus, and in Russia, we see a lot of that pushback against US politics. And then, so now with a liberal leaning, I will say, president coming into the White House, what does that mean for LGBTQ rights worldwide?
Well, I mean, just very quickly, I think we really don't know what's going to happen, right? It seems that after the shock of the Trump administration, I think the Biden administration really still, you know, there's a lot of sort of talk, how liberal, how progressive will the Biden administration be? I think they're figuring out that for themselves. And within that, they have to really also adapt to a changed geopolitical environment, obviously, right? The 2015 world is not the same as the 2020, absolutely not. And so there's a lot of, insecurities about that. The only thing that again, to come back to the larger context, I mean, the Biden administration wants to hold already sort of a global summit of democracies. And again, democracy, right? We don't want to do it Iraq style, you know, sort of implanting, right? Ordering Iraq democracy a la 2003. But I think that broader context of sort of looking at the underlying reasons why minorities of every color and creed are being sort of politicized and securitized in countries. I think that's worth looking at, and I would hope that the Biden administration is a little bit more reflective.
Well, my 2 cents, I would say we can only get better, Erika, from where we were, trust me. And whatever push it is better than what we have so far. You know, the exclusionary practices that this administration had, especially in the region that I study, Islamophobia on the rise, which creates a backlash. Again, when you asked about what does the Middle East think, when you see a country that bans 8 different countries, people from moving around, bluntly calling them that they're radical, they're Muslim, they're not accepted, they're not wanted. Of course, any message, any issue that the West is gonna, especially the US, is gonna push from LGBT rights to the rest, is gonna react to it negatively. And that's the thing that we need to also pay attention how the Biden administration tackles it. Are they going to tackle it from a sensitive way, from bottom up, connecting, building connections with those people on the ground, or are they going to come and impose them, like Marcus was talking about, a la Iraq 2003, or the Arab Rising in Egypt with now Sisi, or Afghanistan? Let's liberate the women there. Now today they're worse than ever before. When Laura Bush said that the only way for the Afghani women to get liberated is by the US getting involved. And if you look at them today, they're in worse shape. But yeah, I am hopeful.
Yeah, I'd like to say that we've learned from our past mistakes, but we will see. And I'd just like to add that, you know, performative action by leaders is performative, right? Like we want to see the actual action, but there is meaning behind, like, you know, President-elect Joe Biden stating, even acknowledging transgender people, that does something, right? As a, you know, as a country that other countries do look to for that leadership, that is a reality. And to hear, you know, an incoming president say and acknowledge that group of people is very important. So the last question we have here, I'm going to change up a little bit. So it says, what do you see as the biggest threats to LGBTQ plus rights in the next decade, and what can we do to address these? And I would invite you to also offer what are the biggest hopes that you see as well. And then we'll end on that.
Okay, I will start with my hope and I will end my participation. Sometimes I really hope love is the only feeling you have in your heart and not hate, because I don't know about a public policy that has been built up with hate that has been successful for humanity. So if you really respect the others, what's the matter loving who you want to love? I think that I can hope for a better humanity where love doesn't make the difference in your life and you can be happy being who you are. That's what I really wish for the whole world. I also wish a world with justice and no poverty, but sometimes that's much to ask, but we will fight for that. And I thank you very much for letting me be part of this wonderful panel. I would love to meet you personally, that perhaps if you come to Madrid, or if I go to university, I don't know, or my boss is there teaching. And I'm really glad I can still have some spaces to talk about human rights and human dignity. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we might not agree on the same things. We're not going to be able to change everybody's minds, especially people that do not think positively about LGBTQ people. They do not accept it, especially conservative people. We see it here in the US and other places. But as long as we agree not to fight, as long as we agree on the basic rights that we might have different opinions, right? But that doesn't mean that we are enemies, that we need to basically annihilate the other or kind of discriminate the other. And I think it starts from there, common humanity.
Biggest threats, biggest hopes, Dr. Theo?
Well, like, yeah, that's a really good question. The biggest threat, I'd say, is probably for me the the exposure, the politicization, and what we call securitization, right? Making them security targets, pawns in a larger, either domestically in a battle, between sort of from democratic forces and authoritarian forces, or internationally, you can see the same. So the big threat for me is that becoming LGBTQ folks becoming pawns of that, exposed pawns, and that turning into a hope. What I now start seeing is that by allying with other social justice forces, and of course there's competition between the various, civil society groups as well that we have to recognize, but there's an overarching goal of sort of, maintaining human rights, maintaining some democratic norms. And so at least, maybe I'm too idealistic, but I'm clamoring to the hope that, for example, in Poland, we've seen after LGBTQ folks have become really a target in the presidential election, and the president got re-elected there, however, with a very short notice. We see now that they started to wanting to restrict abortion rights. There are millions of women on the street, and we can see now a larger front for democracy and democratic norms against, authoritarian systems in Poland. Same happened recently in Russia. Russia had one of the first, had to kind of basically withdraw, not permanently, but withdraw another anti-LGBT draft bill because of the increased process, not only from the community, but also from civil rights opponents, proponents and so on, right? So this is my hope, that we really learn how to work together in order to build broader intersectional fronts that then can stop some of that sort of democratic backsliding.
Wonderful. I think that's a good note to end on, a kind of warning in a way, right? Also. And I just want to say thank you again to our panelists, Dr. Marcus Beal, Dr. Jesse Abu-Arab, Ambassador Ana Helena Chacon. I will definitely take you up on that invitation in Madrid. Thank you all so much for listening in, and thank you again to the Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy and our co-sponsors. We'll be continuing to have these conversations in the future, probably another one next semester. So we hope that you tune in again with new panelists later on.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for the opportunity. Take care.